Let's start with a mini exercise. How many conflicts can you think of in 30 seconds? I'm not sure how many you were able to think of. However, it is highly likely that the feeling as you thought of these conflicts was not necessarily pleasant. It is also likely that some of these were outside of office as well. Let's take a look at the definition of a conflict. A state of disharmony between two or more individuals, usually a clash between two opposing ideas. Although we prefer not to have conflicts, they can lead to outcomes that may actually be good for the team. How do you like that? It is healthy to perceive conflicts as forces of change that are progressive in nature. So, it is important to develop an understanding of conflicts and various approaches that could be applied to resolve them. Let's start with exploring where conflicts come from. This understanding will help you resolve the conflicts more effectively. There are often unwritten rules on how relationships work in a team or in an organization. Let's take manager-subordinate relationship. It may be expected that the subordinate take manager's consent before planning his vacation. It is often an unwritten relationship rule that the subordinate does not contradict his or her manager in front of the customer. Another unwritten rule may be that the subordinate does not make important commitments to the customer without due consultation and approval from the manager. One of the common sources of conflicts is clash of personalities. People are different, aren't they? For example, there are people who need all the information in the world before taking a decision. If you put them to work with someone who is a fast decision maker, conflict is guaranteed. Gender is another source of conflicts. If you're married or know someone who's married, you know what I mean. Role incompatibility is another source of conflicts in organizations. We can think of many examples for this. When I was a project manager, I wanted a high-end test server quickly to meet customer needs, while the procurement function was driven by organization's mandate to reduce costs and wanted to take their own time to get the best prices from vendors. Another example is the tussle between development lead and the testing lead. Although they are both working to achieve the same project objectives, differing focus of their roles often causes conflicts. A development lead could be more focused on timeliness of delivery, while the test lead could be focused on unearthing as many defects as possible. As you can see, there are many such role conflict situations in organizations. They are often there by design to establish the necessary checks and balances in day-to-day operations. Differences in value systems, emotions, perceptions, levels of self-esteem, priorities can cause conflicts. I remember an example where the architect was stringent in adhering to organization's technology standards, while the tech lead for the project wanted deviations from the standard because he believed in incorporating state-of-the-art technologies. Clash of priorities can cause conflicts. Quality assurance function may be insisting on closing non-compliances this week, while the project lead's priority may be to get the quarterly release out this week. Hope that has given you some insight into various sources of conflict. Next, let's examine various conflict resolution techniques. Take a close look at this chart depicting the Thomas Kilmann model. The horizontal axis is about cooperativeness and concern for others, while the vertical axis is about assertiveness and concern for self. As you can see, there are 5 approaches to conflict resolution, depending on whether you are valuing concern for self or for others or both. We will delve into each one of these in more detail. Accommodating technique refers to cooperative and typically unassertive behavior. It gives power to others. It gives higher value to others and lower for self, and it plays down differences. You may be eager to resolve the current conflict so that you can move on to something more important. You may see it important to meet others' need at this point while ignoring what is important to self on this issue. An example? Let's say that the customer would like to reject a candidate for the project, although you believe candidate is the right person for this project. You accommodate customer's point of view and go along with the customer. Accommodating could also be useful in emotionally explosive situations, and accommodating the other person may help defuse it. Forcing technique results in a win-lose situation, often justified by, I convince the other person about the superiority of my solution. It uses coercive power and dominance. There's a greater emphasis on self than others. Resolution is quick, and it does work well in the short term. This style can be useful when a quick or an unpopular decision is required. You may want to be forcing when defending against someone who is trying to act in a selfish way that may be detrimental to the project. A simple example: let's say there is a critical deliverable to the customer next month, and one of your key resources applies for a 3-week vacation for his honeymoon in the period leading up to the release. How would you resolve it? It's a tough one, isn't it? You're likely to force you off priority and delay the vacation. Sometimes, avoiding the conflict is the best approach. Here are some situations. Your power is so low relative to the other person that there is little chance of causing change. Best not to rock the boat. Individual does not have the information to deal with the conflict effectively. Example: argument over how to price the solution to fit into prospective customer's budget, and when nobody knows what that number is. Let's say the issue is minor or of passing importance, not worth the time and effort. For example, team members fighting over where to go for team lunch. Sometimes others can resolve the conflict more effectively. The downside of this approach is on occasions the conflict can flare up and become difficult to control down the track. Compromising as a technique typically leads to a middle-of-the-road resolution. You're willing to give up something in return for gaining something from the other person. Works well when both parties are evenly matched. Both parties are willing to make concessions to arrive at a resolution, maybe because there's a deadline looming or some other compulsion. It may be appropriate for some situations, but this cannot be the default position for all conflicts without due consideration to other approaches. It is useful when the cost of conflict is greater than the cost of the compromise. An example: customer claims 2 of the software requirements are part of the scope of this release and expects them to be delivered on the agreed date. This is not your understanding, and you as the project manager has not included those in your release plan. After a quick discussion, customer and you reach an agreement for one of the requirements to be included to the release to be delivered on the originally agreed date. Customer loses one of the two requirements that he demanded, and the project manager loses on increase in scope without change in deadline. Both parties have compromised. What's the downside of this approach? It's not necessarily optimal if one of the parties is wrong. But sometimes it may be the only way, because this approach often gets unwilling parties to talk to each other. In such cases, it may lead to a better outcome in the long run. By collaborating, parties exchange perspectives and work together to find a win-win solution. There's a sense of acknowledgement that all parties are important and invariably leads to consensus and commitment. Let's take a look at an example. Your team is about to conclude the requirements gathering phase at an overseas customer location. Out of the blue, the customer says he needs more detail in the requirements documentation created by the team before he can sign off. You think, and your team thinks, that the level of detail is adequate. And you also do not want to wish to extend the team on site, incurring major additional costs. So there's a conflict right there. You then probe and find out that the customer's real worry is that end users will keep taking his time for all kinds of clarifications even after a sign-off, and also cause scope creep. The customer, however, understands that your real worry is additional on-site costs. You and the customer get together and come up with an approach to address both interests. The customer would give a conditional sign-off of the documentation as is. The team would return back to base, add more detail to the document, and resubmit. The team would also hold 4 webinars meant specifically for end users who have queries and clarifications. The customer would then provide the final sign-off. Isn't that resolution fair to both parties? Collaborating as an approach does tend to take time but drives ownership of decisions. Here is a concept that may help you to resolve many conflicts. Often, people take positions during a conflict and their positions cannot be fulfilled at the same time. And the situation seems impossible to resolve. Let's take a simple example. Party A says, I want the orange. Party B says, I want the orange too. There is only one orange. At this level of awareness, it is impossible to resolve the situation to the satisfaction of both parties. However, let us identify what interest made them take their positions. We ask a question. What do you want the orange for? Party A would like a glass of orange juice, and Party B would like a facial using the orange peel. Now, doesn't that resolve the conflict in a mutually satisfactory manner? So what's the message? Understanding the interest that led to the position can often help resolve a conflict. We have discussed a few techniques so far. Key message is that one approach does not work in all situations. The right approach for a situation may depend on the relative importance and the intensity of the conflict, time pressure for resolving the conflict, position taken by players involved, and your motivation to resolve the conflict on a long-term or short-term basis. In most situations, it is important to encourage participation rather than act as judge and jury. It is often necessary to step back and think through. We all tend to favor an approach by our own nature. Be aware of that pitfall and choose the most appropriate style. Another general tip is to define and manage expectations of the team members involved in the conflict situation. Often people are carried away by the emotions and become fuzzy about their original expectations that caused the conflict. Help them clarify the specifics and manage the expectations. Finally, the most difficult thing to practice in a conflict situation. It is separating issues from personalities. It may be difficult, but it is most vital for restoring and sustaining harmony in the team. I hope this has given you the basics of conflict resolution techniques, and you will learn a lot more as you apply these concepts in your workplace.